Middle East is no stranger to rapid and hugely consequential conflicts which, when the dust settles, leave behind a very different landscape, both physically, they're so often hugely destructive wars, and politically. Is that what we witnessed over the past couple of weeks in the war between Israel and Iran? The physical destruction was undoubtedly there. The US dropped its largest non-nuclear bunker buster bomb for the first time in anger on Iran's nuclear enrichment facility at Fordow. Meanwhile, Iranian ballistic missiles overwhelmed Israel's aerial defense systems. Both could yet have huge military consequences. Whether or not we're looking at a fundamentally different political landscape is very much still up for debate. For this month's Global Insights, my colleague Kwangwili Wewe and I wanted to speak to citizens of both countries to discuss why the conflict happened when it did, and what, if anything, it achieved. As I had some interviews already lined up on the topic, Kwangwu asked me to step into her regular role hosting Global Insights. Kwangwu, this was a topic you really felt we needed to cover for this month's episode. What stood out to you about the story in particular?
Well, Faisal, it stood out to me because basically the fight between Israel and Iran is getting really more serious, and it could lead to a much bigger fight in the Middle East. So the way I saw it, it's no longer just about secret operations or fights in other countries, but that they're now hitting each other more directly. And this will undoubtedly have an effect on the rest of the world.
Yes, it's now very much out in the open.
Yes, and I knew you'd be able to bring in some guests who are both familiar with the region and also could speak to what it's actually like experiencing the conflict on the ground. So on that note, who did you bring on?
Well, we had a couple of really compelling pieces in the magazine over the past week. The first was by Nahid Siamdoust, an Iranian academic at the University of Texas. She wrote a piece for us about all the competing narratives around the war across Iranian social media networks. We also had one by Ori Goldberg in Tel Aviv discussing the credibility of what Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu gave as his war aims. And we had both Ori and Nahid joining me to discuss those articles on the podcast.
Both interesting guests, but were there any particular insights that stood out for you?
You know, I think the most interesting thing, and this is something you'll hear both guests say separately, it's that whatever the reasons behind starting the conflict, both of the guests felt that the ruling parties in those countries are now losing control over what happens next.
That's a bit worrying, but very interesting. Well, let's hear it. Here's this week's episode of Global Insights on the Lead.
Nahid Siamdoust, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell me what kind of emotions you're hearing from friends and family inside Iran now that the 12-day war is finished?
Certainly relief, lots of relief that the bombing's over. People have returned to their homes. They had all, to the extent that they were able to, they had sought places outside of the urban centers, and Tehran and Tabriz is where I have family, and they're back to their homes, but they're just relieved there's no more bombing. But a sense of sort of puzzlement, but also dread, because, they're on the one hand wondering what this was all for, given the conflicting information we're getting even from Western media about whether the so-called goals of the attack were actually met. And on the other hand, also just wondering how this will really affect the Islamic Republic government going forward in terms of its treatment of its own population, and also in its relations with the US and the Western world.
It's tricky because there's always been this distinction, and you said this in a piece that you wrote for us, between the Iranian people, the public, and the government, the regime. And I think there's a sort of there's probably a feeling inside Iran that this was an imposed war. It just came out of nowhere. That the regime seemed to be negotiating at least I was going to say negotiating in good faith, but at least negotiating, and then suddenly the conflict started.
Yeah, it was certainly perceived as being imposed, but also as a sort of shocking war of betrayal, so to speak, because if you look at the statements that the Trump government had made all the way leading up to this, in fact, many Iranians were really sort of surprised and that the Trump government seemed so eager on negotiations, and they welcomed that, because Iran has been really forced on its knees in terms of its economy and prospects for better livelihood. The rial has crashed. People have become impoverished sort of in a drastic way over the last, let's say, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And so they were surprisingly, sort of pleasantly surprised by the Trump administration's overtures for negotiations. And then all of a sudden, a day or two before the negotiations were supposed to proceed on Sunday, Israel attacked Friday night. So they weren't quite sure how to take this. And then after that, the Trump administration at first said, well, we didn't know about it. We weren't part of this. And then they got fully on board. Once again, waved the flag of negotiations right before dropping, 14 bunker buster bombs on Iran's Fordo site. So it's been a serious whiplash for Iranians over the last 12 to 14 days.
Yeah, I imagine both the public and the government thinks to themselves, well, we tried diplomacy, and I can't imagine the experience of the past 2 weeks will have convinced them of its effectiveness.
For sure. And, you would have thought that the Iranians were already done with diplomacy, given that they had a very sort of hard, nailed out, deal with the Obama government, the JCPOA in 2016. And that had taken about a decade or more to be nailed out. And finally, they had this agreement. And then a couple of years later, the first Trump administration took power and completely just reneged and basically walked out of the deal. But Iranians got back into negotiations with the Americans, and it's just hard to imagine how they will put any value on not just negotiations, but also these international treaties, right? The IAEA and the Non-Proliferation Treaty of the IAEA are meant as measures to keep countries in check and make sure they're not advancing from civilian nuclear power to military nuclear power. And so with this current war, or this very recent war, it just seems not only negotiations, but potentially these international treaties have very little to no value.
I mean, I often think that when I consider what it looks like from the perspective of Iranians, that actually the international community, I mean, they talk a lot about there's this distinction between the public and the regime, as they say, the public and the mullahs. But actually, the behavior of the international community seems like it's determined to push the two of them together, to treat them like they are one, renege on deals, ignore things that they have committed to in the past.
Yeah, that's true. And, I think this is part of the outcome of this war, is that as much as surely Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was hoping the people would come into the streets. In fact, he said so much. He said, now's the time to come into the street and rise up against your government. As much as they all hoped that this would lead to a sort of, regime change that they could at least label authentic. That didn't happen. Not only did that not happen, but Iranians really came together in, I wouldn't say necessarily sort of rallying around the flag, but certainly around the nation and the sense of belonging to a place and a people, and the importance of that cohesiveness to Iranians. So they really just rallied around this message of stop the war, no war, and war is not the answer. As much as we would like to see a more democratic, free government, this is not the way to get there.
I mean, do you think anybody actually believed that the Iranians would say, isn't it wonderful that you're bombing us? That's fantastic. Now's the opportunity for us to... I mean, this is schoolboy thinking.
It is, and yet the Iranian sort of media ecosystem has been so, messed with by pro-Israeli interests and media and propaganda, so much so that as an Iranian today, you don't really have too many ways of consuming news about both Iran and the world at large. Because if you're sticking with Islamic Republic media, it's a lot of also propaganda, just news presented in their own framing. So then what are you left with as far as Persian language media is concerned? You're left with channels like Iran International, which is Saudi funded, but very pro-Israeli in its politics. You're left with Manoto, which is super pro-royalist and also pro-Israel. And then you're left with a lot of, micro social media accounts and influencers who are funded also by Israel adjacent or pro-Israeli organizations and present that kind of worldview. So actually, in the first days of the war, you had some voices coming out and saying, well, if this is going to bring about our, the end of the Islamic Republic, so be it. And it was quite shocking. And it was a statement and a sentiment that a lot of Iranians then came out against and said, what kind of Iranian are you that you're sort of cheering on a foreign government bombing your people and your country, right?
Yeah, and not just... That's why I find this stuff so astonishing, because I mean, were none of these people alive in 2003? We had this exact situation right next door. 3 out of the 4 letters of that country are the same.
Exactly. And not only that, Iran is home to the largest Afghan refugee population, and this population has ballooned again over the last 2-3 years because of what they also saw in Afghanistan, right? And there too, they saw, 20 years ago, they promised this incredible change in Afghanistan. 20 years later, they're back at square one with the Taliban back in power, and actually women being in a worse position than they had been previously. So yeah, they've seen their neighboring countries, right? These are not just countries in the sort of nebulous sort of formulation of the Middle East, right? These are their neighboring countries. It's Afghanistan and Iraq. So they've seen this regime change horror show before, and they knew, despite the sort of, media propaganda that they've been targeted with, they just understand that this is no way forward.
You've actually noted those parallels in the piece that you wrote for us, where you talked about, it's a quote, Iranians have seen this regime change horror show before, most notably in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. Now, like then, the bodies of women serve as sites of this political fantasy of liberation.
Mm-hmm, exactly. In Iran's case, this has been really pronounced, especially since the 2022 Women Life Freedom Uprising. I would say, since it's been even way about 10 years before that, we've had these movements that have converged with a sort of neocon, right-wing politics in the U.S. to demonize the Islamic Republic and bring about changes. And they've always pegged it on, look at the oppression of women in Iran. And in fact, a lot of interesting things have happened in Western media that people have taken note of. So, for example, on The View, this morning show that a lot of, I guess, women in the U.S. and people at large watch, one of the presenters said, the women on Iran, they're uneducated, they're really backward, and they need to be liberated. And it just tells you something about this imperialist hubris, right?
You can't. This is so astonishing.
As a white
you can't
woman,
believe the ignorance.
Right. As a white woman, to think that without knowing the first thing about Iran, you could state something like that on national television when, as we know, or people who know Iran and the Middle East know, Iranian women, in fact, are some of the
incredibly educated,
63 to 4% of university students are women. This is an incredibly well-educated population, both men and women. But the liberation of women has been at the core of this.
But it is kind of, I'll pause you there because it is worth emphasizing for the audience that it is kind of shocking. I mean, everybody's now seen the Tucker Carlson-Ted Cruz interview where Ted Cruz just seems unable to name the ethnic makeup of the country and the population of the country. And Tucker says to him, this is the country you want to bomb and you don't know anything about it. And it's kind of shocking that these kinds of things can just exist in the public conversation.
Absolutely.
But then, and it's the second part that I find most astonishing, even when they are called out, even when somebody says this on The View, there's no retraction.
That's right.
Nobody then says, we're so sorry about that. That was a ridiculous statement. Apologies. What a silly thing to say.
Right,
Nobody
exactly.
says that.
Apparently, they're not even worthy of that, right? Iranian women, Iranian people are not worthy of real consideration. That's why you can make these ridiculous statements about them. And Benjamin Netanyahu has been sort of a master of capitalizing on that, especially since Women Life Freedom. The Israeli media and, under his government have really taken on to, yes, Women Life Freedom is basically anti-Islamic Republic. It's about women's liberation, and we are on board with women's liberation in Iran, and Israelis, and the Israeli prime minister is going to come to liberate Iran's women, right?
The Israelis have another brilliant idea for who would be a democratic leader for a new modern Iran, and that would be the son of the monarch. That would be a great idea. I was in central London earlier this week, and I saw some guy riding past with the monarchist flag, the old pre-1979 flag, and he had a T-shirt with Reza Pahlavi on it. And I had this moment where I thought. I don't know if the audience is familiar with the TV show Friends, but I had this moment where I thought of the character in Friends where he's like, is that guy back? Is that guy back? This is the person? And I think about it, I know you were saying about how uneducated society Iran is, and it is, it's an extraordinarily educated society within the country now, and of course Iranians in the diaspora. It's a 7,000-year-old civilization. people all around the world could serve in the government.
Right.
This is the best that there is on offer.
Right. And, Reza Pahlavi really has pegged, and his circle have really sort of pegged their success and return to Iran and leadership on the Israelis, actually. They have thought that by aligning themselves with forces like AIPAC here in the U.S. and by, Reza Pahlavi paying a visit to Jerusalem, which he did a couple of years ago, and really widely distributing those photographs, that somehow this narrative would really become victorious in Iran. And not just the narrative, but the factuality of bringing him back to the throne. And I think he thought he was pretty close just by, I think in many ways the Israelis probably used him for their purposes of promising regime change and all of that. And who knows if they were serious about it or not. Reza Pahlavi would certainly be a good candidate for Israel on the throne in Iran.
He'd be a good candidate for himself. I mean, does he have a particularly high-flying job that he'd have to leave? I can't remember.
No, but he did say that he has a social life in America and that he probably could only spend half his life.
Oh, yeah. We were laughing about this. One of our colleagues said, he might have to zoom in to do the job. It'd be remote work.
Right.
It's just crazy stuff. I know we're laughing about it, but I mean, it's really serious. They're dropping bombs to try to make this happen.
That's right.
It's kind of shocking that. And actually, it says something, I think, not only about the conversation within the United States. I think it says something about the Iranian opposition. And this was something I think you mentioned about the opposition within Iran itself, where you were talking about how, this is a quote, many fear being robbed of the prospective rewards of the slow work that they have done over many years to determine their own fate and to secure a brighter future. And some of that, I think, within Iran and now without, is probably going to go away because there's going to be a feeling that if you are opposing the mullahs, well, that must mean you were very happy about the bombing.
I think, unfortunately, I really fear that kind of outcome of this war, because what Israel and the U.S. has tried to do on capitalizing on Iranian protests, the Women Life Freedom Uprising and all of that is to say, Iranians want regime change and we are on the side of the people, right? But just not parsing apart this notion that, yes, they want to get to a more democratic system, but that does not mean that they support bombardment of their country by foreign forces. That does not mean that they support a criminal Israeli government that has been, killing and starving tens of thousands of Palestinians for close to 2 years, to somehow have this, what should we even call it, to have this arrogance to think that Iranians would welcome somebody like that. As much as Iranians have resented the Islamic Republic's support for the Palestinian cause, in part because they felt that all that support for Palestinian groups in the region, Islamist sort of militias, Hamas, Hezbollah, this and that, has really taken away from resources going into building the country or creating better relations with the West and so on. They're humane. This is a humane society. This is a society, some of whose sort of biggest cultural jewels are poetry and the arts. So to think that a society like that would welcome a war criminal to liberate them is just so extremely ignorant of Iranian society.
It's incredibly ugly. I mean, the whole situation, a colleague of ours described it as very just ugly. And it is ugly because, as you say, whatever you think of the situation inside Iran, the regime has spent the last few years building up these militias, killing people in Syria, arming the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, it's been an awful situation. And you can imagine that Iranians think to themselves, look, if that came to an end and we had a positive, democratic, stable, that would be fantastic. But is that going to come at the point of a B-2 bunker buster bomb?
No, I think in many ways, unfortunately, this war has affirmed the propaganda of the Islamic Republic. They have said death to America, death to Israel, and that they are the world imperialists, the repressors of the betrodden in the world. And now the U.S. and Israel have, in fact, demonstrated those slogans in action. I still sort of retain a 2% hope that the Islamic Republic looks at what happened and says, look at this, our people didn't come out against us at our direst, darkest hour, right? There was a moment for a day or two when it seemed possible that the Islamic Republic would fall. A whole layer of their military commanders had been shaved off, right, by the first attack. And so I still retain a tiny bit of hope that they look at this and say, okay, let's change things. Let's allow for more political rights. Let's allow for more social rights. Let's open up a little bit and allow our country to benefit economically through economic relations with the West. And I still retain a little bit of hope that they might do that. But on the other hand, I will say, I imagine, given what's happened, that they're just going to become much more suspicious and distrusting of any notion of negotiations or trade or opening, and become much more distrustful of their own populations, because we know that there was a high degree of infiltration by Mossad and other spies in Iran for them to be able to basically capture generals in their bedrooms, right? A whole number of them. And so I think the more likely scenario is that we might see a more repressive political situation. I hope I will bite my tongue and that I'm completely wrong, and that this will bring some kind of, aha moment to the Islamic Republic to try to really fundamentally change things for a population that has tried so hard and so valiantly to create a better present and a better future for themselves.
It's hard to see how that 2% hope might transpire, because even if the Islamic Republic government sees what you say it could see, that the people didn't rise up, would they not interpret that to say, actually, it seems like we have quite a lot of support. They didn't rise up against us, so let's keep doing what we're doing.
That's possible too. We can see even from within the ranks of the Islamic Republic, there are a lot of people who criticize the system. There are a lot of dissenters, even from within their own children, the children of all these officials.
Right. Yeah.
And
they're aware of the dissent within the country.
Aware.
That's why they repress it so hard.
That's right. And in some ways, they had this conflation of resistance to the regime and welcoming foreign powers. In some ways, they kind of had it coming for them, because following all these uprisings, and especially sort of the glorious sort of woman life freedom movement, the government didn't give its own population an inch. Right? They didn't say, okay, well, we don't have to enforce the hijab so badly. They actually tried to put it in the laws, because so far there isn't actually a very clear law for the mandatory hijab and for punishment. But they tried to put some of those elements into Iran's legal code. So they didn't give the population an inch. However, I think one must also highlight this, that even though that was happening on the political and legal level, on the streets, Iran has transformed, right? Even from, compared to 2022 before the uprising, Iran has transformed. Now, when you look at images and you talk to your relations in Iran, in large parts of urban centers, women are no longer wearing their headscarves. This is unbelievable. And it's not something that I could have fathomed even a day before the Woman Life Freedom uprising, right? So on the ground, women have actually pushed their bodily sort of autonomy and agency into public spaces. And the state can't really counter that on that kind of mass level. And they've kind of let it go on those fronts. But so hopefully, I don't know, I think the Islamic Republic either needs to have a huge sort of drastic rethink of how it governs, or it's going to be facing more of what it's already faced in the last decades of more dissent, more uprisings, and
Nahid Siamdoust, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
That was Nahid Siamdoust. I also spoke to Ori Goldberg, an independent political analyst, who joined me from Tel Aviv. Ori Goldberg, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We previously heard from Nahid Siamdoust. Can you give me an impression of what it's been like to be under aerial bombardment for the last 12 days?
It hasn't been fun. We didn't get to sleep much because most of the barrages came in the early AMs. And generally, there was a sense of chaos that got stronger as the 12-day war grew longer. It was a confusing time. People were addled, and nobody was clear on what was open and what wasn't, and government ministries were shut, and some private businesses did open and others didn't. Restaurants and cafes usually just delivered. But there was a
Yeah.
real desire for everything to seem normal because we're big on national resilience.
Yeah, I mean, I found that very interesting. That I was amazed because it was a sudden war, and I don't think many people expected it. It wasn't telegraphed in advance, apart from being telegraphed over multiple years, as you've pointed out. But I was amazed at how easily Israelis accepted this Netanyahu war.
Yeah. There are two reasons for that. One has to do specifically with Iran. Because really, there's an entire generation of Israelis. I know I have my daughter, my eldest, will turn 22 in July. And she has never consciously known an Israel that was not led by Netanyahu. There was like an 18-month hiatus, but she's only ever known Netanyahu as prime minister. And under Netanyahu, a generation of Israelis and their parents and an entire country grew up on the notion that Iran was Israel's existential enemy, that it's the only thing on Iranian minds was the destruction of Israel, and that the nuclear program was the main manifestation of that mindset, because the minute the Iranians had a nuclear bomb, they would use it on us. So the general thought was that inevitably we will go to war with Iran at some point, and we will fend off that threat, and we will show the Iranians what we're made of. It doesn't matter that Israel has had dozens, if not more, of the nuclear devices deliverable on a broad variety of platforms, whereas Iran doesn't even have one. But the general mindset of, we're not the same. We're not the same as anybody. We're peace loving, and all we want to do is be left alone. And as long as people insist on not allowing us that privilege, then we have to fight. So we'll fight. That's one reason. The second reason is that generally at heart, we're soldiers, and we prize collective resilience above everything else. Also, over the past, decade or so, there's been a sense that Israeli society is fragmenting, and nothing unites Israelis, Jewish Israelis, that is, like a good war. It reinvigorates us, gets the blood flowing in the veins, and gives us a sense of purpose. We can talk about the mistakes of those who lead us, but we can also talk about the imminent resurrection and rising from the ashes, that's our dynamic. We do things badly for a long period of time, which leads to a war, but then the war gives us the means of resurrection.
Do you think that's a healthy dynamic? I mean, I was looking at the, I was looking at the Israeli. I mean, I think of it like this, right? In many ways, of course, I mean, Israel is still engaged in a war, maybe multiple wars, but at heart, the society is a normal society. People have jobs. They have to take their kids to school. They have to attend university, those sorts of things, right? And so when this war suddenly starts, now they have to flee their homes, they have to leave the country, they have to go into bomb shelters. And I think to myself, does nobody mind doing that? Like, does nobody say, look, Netanyahu, I understand we have to fight the Iranians, but can we do it next week because this week I have a meeting?
I've done really dozens of interviews over the past 2 weeks, and that is probably the question I've been asked most frequently. And there's a reason, because really I think in just about every country, and I've been talking to people from Pakistan to New Zealand, that seems like a very logical question. I mean, yes, the politicians are the ones who make the decisions about going to war, but ultimately what the citizens want, what the ordinary people want, is a stable life. And at some point, we get weary, we grow weary of this war that was imposed on us, and we will begin to criticize the government. But that's not the case in Israel. And I chuckled when you asked if I thought this was a healthy dynamic. Of course it's not a healthy dynamic. It's a remarkably sick dynamic. I don't want to say perverted, because apparently it isn't, but it's a remarkably sick dynamic, and it's not conducive to life, and it doesn't sustain any kind of a long-lasting anything from productivity to even a national spirit. It's dependent on a vicious cycle that keeps getting smaller yet more intense every time of conflict and resolution. But in Israel, no, we don't. War, like I said, part of it has to do with the sense of fragmentation in Israeli society and this reassertion of what for us is a sort of a basic fact, which is that we are all in this boat together, and if we don't take care of ourselves, nobody will. because, the world doesn't like us.
And that kind of story that Israelis tell themselves is much easier to hold on to during an actual conflict, like a hot conflict.
It is best held on to during conflict.
Best, yeah.
So,
something that Netanyahu is not unaware of.
No, he's not. He is in that sense, Netanyahu is not. He's often described as this magician, but he's also the consummate epitome of an Israeli. He knows this in his bones, not just as a means of manipulation. He understands this. I think he too feels invigorated by conflict, even though during his years as prime minister, he's often been reticent about the use of very overt violence. But I think something happened on October 7th, 2023, that let the cat among the pigeons that Israelis think they are. Something that was, part of our collective id demanded a place in our collective superego. We've always talked about, I remember this from my boyhood. I remember dinner conversations, and the question was always the same. If you had a big red button that you could press and tomorrow all the Palestinians would be gone, would you press it? And just about everybody said, of course I would. But that's not realistic.
It's not a question of whether it's morally right or it's a human thing to do.
No.
It's just, that's not a realistic thing. There's no button.
Precisely, which is, by the way, that was the main Israeli response after President Trump talked about his notorious plan for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, which of course never came true because it was a Trump remark of the sort that even Trump doesn't bother to think about after he's made it. But yeah, everybody thought it was perfectly normal.
This for the audience is Trump's idea that 2.2 Palestinians would just simply leave and go and live elsewhere.
Yeah. Which he made when he was talking to Netanyahu after he took office and wanted to appear like a tough guy and pro-Israel, which, by the way, and that I think is a really interesting point, that disappeared very quickly. I think Trump really doesn't like Netanyahu, and I think Trump really doesn't trust Netanyahu. And I think Trump doesn't want to be associated completely and exclusively with Israel.
Do you think that he felt played by Netanyahu? I mean, it was very obvious that the war started as soon as the Iranian nuclear talks seemed like they were going somewhere.
If he certainly felt played by Netanyahu during his first term. You remember the New York Times cartoon that showed, was it the New York Times that showed Netanyahu walking Trump on a leash? That was a very big deal for Trump. And very recently, Trump dismissed his national security advisor after Mike Walsh was talking too closely to Netanyahu and his confidants when the Netanyahu entourage was visiting the White House. So I don't think Trump cares excessively about Israel, nor is he beholden to either AIPAC or the evangelicals, maybe the Adelsons, but even there, he didn't need anybody in particular to deliver his 2024 victory. So I think Trump, was interested and was in it to figure out what he could leverage out of it. And that's true for both Gaza and Iran.
I mean, there's a curious lack of morality about Trump. So your interpretation is that he realized he was being bounced into this war, but then once he was in the war, he thought to himself, you know what, we may as well, this might give me a chance to take out the nuclear facilities, appear to be the tough guy, let's just do it.
I think there's a good chance he even thought that before he had been bounced into the war. I don't think he was necessarily manipulated. And also, by the way, striking Iran's nuclear facilities sends a clear message, not just to Israel and with regard to Israel, but to Trump's very good friends in the Gulf. Both the Saudis and the Emiratis probably sleep better at night knowing that Trump has the capability and the will, should he so choose, to attack Iran if Iran ever comes for them.
Interesting. So, that is a big thing. I think you're right.
Yeah. So Trump had a lot. And one of the reasons I think that's true is because this was a very limited, curtailed strike. Even though it was a big deal, there were B-2s. They dropped their bombs, very much a Star Wars moment. Yeah. And then they left. Trump didn't join the war on Israel's behalf. Trump didn't provide Israeli fighters with a missile cover or air cover. Trump just, got the bombs unloaded and left, which to me doesn't suggest a real commitment to providing Israel with a historic victory. And he definitely, again, took it for all it was worth. But I think that's what he wanted to do. He didn't want a relationship.
And it's the kind of thing that you can see him enjoying, that
Yes.
he gets to demonstrate American technological superiority. He gets to drop this bomb, which has never been dropped before, this kind of thing.
Precisely. And I think he also wanted to quell rising criticism among the right wing of the MAGA movement. And he saw that this was going to erupt about him joining a land war in the Middle East, that he also knows the right wing of the MAGA movement. And once they're up in arms, they're not going to stop. So he wanted to appear a commander-in-chief and a tough guy. And he got all of that from this strike without really needing to commit like, for example, Joe Biden did.
Right. Let's talk about your piece, because you wrote an interesting essay for us this week called "What Did Israel Achieve with its 12-Day War Against Iran?" So let's start there. What do you think it did achieve? Let's say politically, and then let's say among the public in Israel.
If you'll permit me, let's start with the military aspect. And there, Israel achieved a whole host of tactical wins. It hit various targets across Iran, including missile silos and launching facilities and various sites associated with the nuclear program. And it achieved aerial superiority over the entirety of Iran very quickly and demonstrated that it could do so with relative ease. And those definitely were important victories. So Israel definitely achieved that, but it couldn't have achieved more because there were no really well-defined goals for this war. When you don't have well-defined goals, you can't really have well-defined achievements. It's like Alice in Wonderland talking to the Cheshire Cat about instructions. If you don't know where to go, it doesn't matter which way you take. So Israel had a lot of tactical wins, but no strategic wins at all. And also, as the war grew longer, Israel, and one would have thought Israel would have gotten used to it from Gaza, Israel appeared less in control, more driven by the simple urge to bomb. I mean, there were moves there that really were, that really redefined lane, like bombing Evin prison, the infamous political prison in Tehran, and calling it Israel's contribution to the struggle of the Iranian people against the regime.
That was very kind. That was a very useful thing.
The only people who were hurt were the prisoners.
Well, the Iranian opposition was no doubt very pleased with that.
Very much so. And all the pleas to the Iranian people to rise up and rebel. Very much akin to the Israeli genuine thought that if we starve the Palestinians in Gaza, then the Palestinians will rebel against Hamas because they would have an incentive not to starve. So the longer the war grew, the more Israel resorted to these kinds of things, like bombing the clock in the Tehran square that counted down the time to 2040 when Israel would dissolve itself. And so I think ultimately Israel came out of this war not looking very good. And I haven't even said a word about all the missiles that the Israeli Heartland took.
That was something that I thought was very interesting. We've talked a lot among our colleagues about the way that the deterrence that Iran was demonstrating for so many years went away. But it also works the other way around. I mean, the Iron Dome got overwhelmed relatively quickly, and it was astonishing how much damage was done. And I thought, if this goes on a long time, you might actually, you talk about the Iranians rising up, the Israelis might rise up and go, we don't want this anymore.
I think there was a better chance the Iranians would rise up than the Israelis rising up. But yes, there was a lot of damage. And I wouldn't put it past my leaders to hide some of the scope of the damage. The Iranians knew exactly where they were firing. And there was a lot of damage, even, just seemingly random, but to civilian neighborhoods and to various installations and to infrastructure installations. And it kept going and going and going. The system, the famous air defense system, was infiltrated and permeated quite easily. And, exactly as you say, deterrence is a double-edged sword. The Iranian deterrence, as far as allowing Israeli fighters to move in, was certainly shattered if it existed at all, because Iran doesn't really have a functional air force. But Israel came into this war seeming invincible, and it really did not emerge invincible from this war.
So where do you think this stalemate now leaves the Israel-Iran conflict? Let's start with Iran. Do you think that it will make the Tehran regime think, you know what, let's actually get a nuclear weapon as the only defense?
There's reason to believe so, but I also think Iran has a lot of points to win if it actually demonstrates cooperation and sort of calms things down. Obviously, striving for a nuclear weapon right now would bring the ire of the world down upon Iran. Our world leaders demonstrated that was what they were quite happy to do, regardless of Israel or because of Israel. It doesn't matter. I think Iran has a lot to gain from appearing like a responsible potential partner. And that has a lot to do with the fact that Israel has spent the last 15 years easily drilling into the international community's head the basic inequality. Israel good, Iran bad. Thing is, that also works the other way around. So when Israel is bad, that makes Iran look good. So I would assume that this is on Iranian minds as well.
And then with Israel, where do you think the Israeli government is? Do you think we'll be back in another conflict in a couple of months or a couple of years maybe?
No, I don't. I think Israel is going to start a slow process of political implosion. I don't think this government has a long time in office just now. I think this is going to take a while, but I think Israel is very much not in control of its destiny. Israel can kill and destroy and strafe and attack, but that's all Israel can do. And this war in Iran exposed that very clearly. If the international community, and perhaps an unlikely alliance of the global north and the global south, can come together on this and rein Israel in, I don't think Israel can do anything to resist that. Israel can't go it alone. Israel can't be the new Sparta of the world. Israel is dependent on the world. So I think what Israel is going to do is just really take a very lengthy time out, maybe it'll be superimposed, and deal with its own crap, basically, if you'll pardon my French.
You mean that with the Netanyahu government taking the war on its neighbors as far as it can go, to the point of starting a war with the bogeyman Iran, and you think that now they will have to retrench and have to kind of look inward, and that's something that, I mean, really, the Netanyahu government, especially Netanyahu, has been trying very hard not to do.
That's right. But the Netanyahu government has exhausted its options, except for doing what it did in Iran. But who's it going to attack now? What fabrication are we going to present the world with now to justify this new security doctrine that we have, which basically says that as long as we attack, we're secure? I think momentum has shifted. I think this war with Iran was not favorably received all over the world, despite the cowardly statements of people like the German Chancellor and the British Prime Minister. I think even in the EU, the opposition will soon be stronger than the current placating leadership. And I think nobody wants to placate Netanyahu anymore. So I think they're just going to let Israel wallow in its own misery and maybe come up with a kind of a Marshall Plan style package for the Palestinians. I hope so. I don't know if that's going to happen. But Israel is going to be withdrawing, I think, over the next few years.
Ori Goldberg, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Global Insights on The Lead. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For a deeper understanding of global news and current affairs, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app, where you'll find Global Insights the last Friday of every month.